There we go. All right, let's see now. Yep, now it's good. Now it's perfect.
And it's about fine.
As Susan wanders up. I'm just going to say one thing. Hi, I'm not Susan Miller. This is Susan Miller.
I am.
We want to thank you for joining us during these Advent Wednesdays. Next Wednesday will be a little different, but tonight we have again, for this time, a gift that Susan's been giving Trinity and giving all of you. We hope you've been able to watch it or catch it later. Please do enjoy these opportunities to learn crafts. And now I'm going to turn over to Susan.
Good evening to this, our third Wednesday in Advent. Tonight we're going to talk actually about the fourth candle, the candle of love, both in our story and in some of the crafts we might do. I know that all of you know the real meaning of Christmas, but that sometimes gets lost in the, how do you say it, all the glitter and the glamour and the Santa Clauses and the Frosty the Snowman and all the Christmas specials and the Grinches and the ugly Christmas sweaters. And people forget that Christmas is about the birth of a little baby so long ago, who came as a gift from God for each of us. And so I hope in your homes, as decorated as they might be, that you have a special place for a nativity scene, or a creche, as it's often called. There are all different kinds of nativity scenes. You can get really fancy ones. Believe it or not, I have 15 of them. Some are big, and some are very small. Some I made, some my children made, some my students made or gave to me. Tonight, I want to suggest an easy way to put a nativity in your house. Here is a simple one to make. I made it using wax paper and tissue paper. I put it with glue, the tissue paper on the wax paper, and cut out a template. Templates you can get from a coloring book. Or if you want a different kind, you can download it from free printables or free clip art. When you get the tissue paper all glued, I like glitter, so I put some glitter on it. And then I glued the template in black on the top. And I have a nativity. And it looks beautiful at night if you put it in the window, just like stained glass. Or if you're outside playing, you might find a rock that maybe looks like it could be a nativity. Here's a rock painted with Mary, Joseph, the baby, and the star. Here's another rock that's a manger with a baby in it. And finally, have some fun and create a drawn nativity. This is one our son, who's now 45, made when he was in kindergarten. So there are all different ways to portray the Christ child. This one is a wood carving, and we are going to talk about a wood carver in our story today. This is one my father made. It doesn't have a baby yet because it's Mary, as she's expecting the Son of God. And I like her expression because it shows peace, which was our candle previously, and joy, when she said, "My soul magnifies the Lord." All right? So you can do nativities or creches in many different ways. Now, tonight, our story is called The Christmas Miracle of Jonathan Tomey. Settle in. It's a good one. The village children called him Mr. Gloomy, but in fact his name was Toomey, Mr. Jonathan Toomey. And though it's not kind to call people names, this one fit quite well. For Jonathan Toomey seldom smiled, and he never laughed. He went about mumbling and grumbling, muttering and sputtering, grumping and griping. He complained that the church bells rang too often, that the birds sang too shrilly, and that the children were always playing too loudly. You could say he was not a happy man. Mr. Toomey was a wood carver. Some said he was the best wood carver in the whole valley. He spent his days sitting at a workbench carving beautiful shapes from blocks of pine and hickory and chestnut wood. After supper, he sat in a straight-back chair near the fireplace, smoking his pipe and staring into the flickering flames. Jonathan Toomey wasn't an old man, but if you saw him, you might think he was, the way he walked bent forward with his head down. You wouldn't notice his eyes, the clear blue of an August sky. And you wouldn't see the dimple on his chin, since his face was mostly hidden under a shaggy, untrimmed beard, speckled with sawdust and wood shavings, and, depending on what he had eaten that day, with crumbs of bread, or a bit of potato, or even dried gravy. The village people didn't know it, but there was a reason for his gloom, a reason for his grumbling, a reason why he walked hunched over as if carrying a great weight on his shoulders. Some years earlier, when Jonathan Toomey was young and full of life and full of love, his wife and baby had become very sick. And because these were the days before hospitals and medicines, and even no skilled doctors were available, his wife and baby died, 3 days apart from each other. So Jonathan Toomey had packed up his belongings into a wagon and traveled until his tears had stopped. He settled into a tiny house at the edge of a village to do his wood carving. One day in early December, there was a knock at Jonathan's door. Mumbling and grumbling, he went to answer it. There stood a woman and a young boy. I am the widow McDowell. I'm new in our village. This is my son Thomas, the woman said. I'm 7, and I know how to whistle, said Thomas. Whistling is pish-posh, said the wood carver gruffly. I need something carved," said the woman, and she told Jonathan about a very special set of Christmas figures her grandfather had carved for her when she was but a young girl. "After I moved here, I discovered that they were lost," she explained. "I had hoped that by some miracle I would find them again, but it has not happened." "There's no such thing as miracles," the woodcarver said. Could you describe the figures for me?" "Well," she said, "there were sheep." "Two," said Thomas, "with curly wool." "Yes, two," said the widow, "and a cow, an angel, Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, and the wise men." "Three of them," added Thomas. "Will you take the job?" asked the widow. "I will." "I'm grateful. How soon can you have them ready?" "They'll be ready when they are ready," he said. "But I must have them by Christmas. They mean very much to me. I cannot remember a Christmas without them." "Christmas is pish-posh," said Jonathan gruffly, and he closed the door. The following week, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. Muttering and sputtering, he went to answer it. There stood the widow McDowell and Thomas. "Excuse me," said the widow, "but Thomas has been begging to come and watch you work. He says he wants to be a woodcarver when he grows up and would like to watch you, since you are the best in the valley." "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here." "Please, please," piped up Thomas. With a grumble, the woodcarver stepped aside to let them in. He pointed to a stool near his workbench. "No talking, no jiggling, no noise," he ordered Thomas. The widow McDowell handed Mr. Toomey a warm loaf of cornbread as a token of thanks. Then she took out her knitting and sat down in a rocking chair in the far corner of the cottage. "No, not there," he bellowed. "No one sits in that chair." So she moved to the straight-back chair by the fire. Thomas sat very still. Once when he needed to sneeze, he pressed a finger under his nose to fight it back. Once, when he wanted desperately to scratch his leg, he counted to 20 to keep his mind off the itch. After a very long time, Thomas cleared his throat and whispered, "Mr. Toomey, may I ask a question?" The woodcarver glared at Thomas and then shrugged his shoulders and granted Thomas's request. Thomas decided it meant, "Okay. Is that my sheep you're carving?" The woodcarver just nodded and grunted. After another very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but you're carving my sheep all wrong." The widow McDowell's knitting needles stopped clicking. Jonathan Toomey's knife stopped carving. Thomas went on, "It's a beautiful sheep, nice and curly, but my sheep looked happy." "That's pish-posh," said Mr. Toomey. "Sheep are sheep. They can't look happy." "Mine did," said Thomas. "They knew they were with the baby Jesus, so they were happy." After that, Thomas was quiet the rest of the afternoon. When the church bells chimed 6, Mr. Toomey grumbled under his breath about the awful noise. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas sneezed 3 times and thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening after supper, of cornbread and boiled potatoes, the woodcarver sat at his bench. He picked up his knife and he picked up the sheep. He worked and worked and worked till his eyelids started to droop. A few days later, there was another knock on the door. Griping and grumbling, the woodcarver went to answer. There stood the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" "I'll be quiet," said Thomas. He settled himself on the stool very quietly while his mother had a basket of sweet-smelling raisin buns and laid it on the table. teapot is warm, Mr. Toomey said gruffly, his head bent over his work. While Mr. Toomey carved the widow poured tea, she touched the woodcarver gently on the shoulder and placed a cup of tea and a bun next to him. He pretended not even to notice her, but she noticed that pretty soon the bun and the tea were gone. Thomas tried to eat the bun his mother had given him as quietly as he could, but it's impossible to be 7 and eat a warm, sticky bun without making smacking, licking, satisfied noises. When Thomas had finished, he tried to sit quietly. And once, without thinking, he began to swing his legs, but the woodcarver stopped him. After a very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask a question?" "Oh," said the woodcarver. "Is that my cow you're carving?" "Mm-hmm." Another very long time went by, then Thomas cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but I must tell you something. That is a beautiful cow, the most beautiful cow I've ever seen, but it's not right." My cow looked proud. "That's pish-tosh," growled the woodcarver. "Cows are cows." My cow looked proud. It knew that Jesus chose to be born in the barn, in his barn, so it was proud. Thomas was quiet for the rest of the afternoon, and when the church bells chimed at 6, Mr. Toomey muttered under his breath about the noise. The widow said it was time to leave, and she and Thomas went out the door. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes and raisin sticky buns, the woodcarver sat down at his bench. He picked up the carving knife, he picked up the cow, and he worked late into the night until his eyelids were drooping. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He smoothed down his hair as he went to answer it. At the door were the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" As Mrs. McDowell warmed the tea and put a plate of fresh molasses cookies on the workbench, Thomas watched the woodcarver. After a long time, Thomas said, "Mr. Toomey, is that my angel you're carving?" "Yes, and would you do me the favor of telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong?" "Well, my angel looked like one of God's most important angels because it was sent to baby Jesus." "And how does one make an angel look important?" asked the woodcarver. "You'll be able to do it," said Thomas. "You're the best woodcarver in the valley." After another long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask you another question?" "Do you ever stop talking?" asked the woodcarver. "My mother says I don't. She says I could learn about the virtue of silence from you." Under his beard, the woodcarver's face turned pink. "Well, speak up. What's your question?" "Mr. Toomey, will you teach me how to carve?" "I'm a very busy man," grumbled the woodcarver, but he put down the important angel. "You will learn to carve a bird." "A robin, I hope," said Thomas. "I like robins." With a piece of charcoal, the woodcarver sketched a robin on a piece of brown paper. He handed Thomas a small block of pine and a knife. He showed him how to lop the corners from the block and slowly smooth the edges. They worked so hard that when the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Jonathan Toomey was holding Thomas's hand in his, guiding the knife along the edges. He didn't hear them ringing. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Jonathan was so excited, he thanked the woodcarver for teaching him how to carve. Later, after a supper of boiled potatoes and molasses cookies, Jonathan Toomey went to his workbench. He thought for a long time, and he sketched drawing after drawing. Finally, he picked up his carving knife and the angel and carved until his eyes drooped. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. Mr. Toomey jumped up to answer it. There stood the widow with a bouquet of pine boughs and holly sprigs, dotted with berries. And there stood Thomas, clutching his partly carved robin. Next, I will carve the wise men and Joseph, the woodcarver said. Perhaps before I begin, you will tell me about all the mistakes I am going to make. Well, said Thomas, my wise men were wearing their most wonderful robes because they were going to visit Jesus. And my Joseph was leaning over baby Jesus like he was protecting him. He looked very serious. When the two had left at the end of the day, Jonathan looked around. It looked different with the bouquet of pine and holly sprigs on the table. That evening, he ate his supper of boiled potatoes, and he worked on Joseph and the wise men. And his eyes drooped closed. What do we have left? Uh-oh. I think we have left for Mary. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He dusted the crumbs from his beard, brushed the sawdust from his shirt. At the door were, you guessed it, the widow McDowell and Thomas. All afternoon, Thomas watched the woodcarver work. When it was time to leave, Jonathan said, I'm about to begin the last two figures, Mary and the baby. Can you tell me, Thomas, how they looked? They were the most special of all, said Thomas. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to his mother, and Mary looked like she loved him very much. Thank you, Thomas, said the woodcarver. Tomorrow is Christmas. Is there any chance the figures will be ready? Asked the widow. They will be ready when they are ready. I understand, said the widow. And she handed Jonathan 2 packages. Merry Christmas, she said. Jonathan folded his arms across his chest. I want no presents, he said harshly. That's exactly why we're giving them, answered the widow. She put them on the table, and they left. Jonathan sat down at the table. Slowly, he opened the first package. Inside was a bright red scarf, hand-knit, warm and bright. He tied the scarf around his neck. It was what the widow had been knitting every time she came to visit. The other parcel held a little robin, crudely carved of pine. A smile twitched at the corners of Jonathan's mouth as he ran his fingers over the lopsided wings. He dusted the fireplace mantle with his sleeve and placed the robin exactly in the center so he could look at it from his chair. The woodcarver did not eat supper that day. Instead, he began to sketch the final figures, Mary and Jesus. He drew Mary and wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it on the floor. He drew the baby, wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it along with the first one. He sketched again, and once more he crumpled it into a ball. Soon there was a mountain of crumpled paper at his feet. He picked up a block of wood and tried to carve, but his knife would not do what he wanted. He hurled the chunk of wood into the fireplace and sat staring into the flames. When he heard the church bells announcing the midnight Christmas service, he got up. Slowly, he opened the drawer beneath the cupboard in the kitchen. From it, he took the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. He took out a rough woolen shawl and a lace handkerchief. He took out a tiny white baby blanket and a little tiny pair of blue socks. He placed each piece gently on the floor. From the bottom of the drawer, he lifted out a picture frame, beautifully carved of deep brown chestnut wood. In the frame was a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a rocking chair, holding a baby. The baby's arms were reaching up, touching the woman's face. The woman was looking down at the baby, smiling. Jonathan sat down in his rocking chair and held the picture against his chest. He rocked slowly, his eyes closed. 2 tears trailed down into his beard. Then he took the picture to his workbench and began to carve. His fingers worked quickly and surely. He carved all through the night. The next day there was a knock on the widow's door. When she opened it, there stood the wood carver, his neck wrapped in a red scarf, holding a wooden box stuffed with straw. "Mr. Toomey, what a surprise! Merry Christmas!" "The figures are ready," he said as he stepped inside. From the box, Jonathan unpacked 2 curly sheep, happy sheep, because they were with Jesus. He unpacked a proud cow and an angel, a very important-looking angel, with mighty wings stretching from its shoulders right down to the hem of its gown. He unpacked 3 wise men wearing their most wonderful robes, edged with fur and falling in rich folds. He unpacked a serious and caring Joseph, and he unpacked Mary, wearing a rough woolen shawl, looking down, loving her precious baby son. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to touch his mother's face. That day, Jonathan went to the Christmas service with the widow McDowell and Thomas. And that day in the churchyard, the village children saw Jonathan throw back his head, showing his eyes a clear blue as an August sky, and they heard him laugh. And no one ever called him Mr. Gloomy again. Isn't it amazing that a baby can change a person's heart? Will you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for loving us so much that you sent your Son as a tiny baby to be our Savior. May we celebrate and rejoice in such a special gift. And may his love change our lives, especially this Christmas. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you for listening to the story, and may your Christmas celebration be filled with love, joy, peace, and hope.
About the life nativity.
Oh, no, go ahead. Them know. We're
Hey, Barbara.
That's going to be on Wednesday.
No, I was just thinking, I was just thinking about